He said they couldn't touch him. He was right, until truth did. 17-year-old Jaxon Reed had already learned one rule on the streets: fear gets followers. When the robbery that marked his notoriety left a store clerk dead, he didn't run. He laughed. Cameras caught him grinning through arrest, joking that he would trend by sundown. In court, he doubled down, mocking the judge, flashing double peace signs, calling the prosecutor fan number 1. Reporters ate it up. His smirk became a meme before the closing arguments finished. Then the prosecutor pressed play. The entire courtroom froze as his own video filled the screen. Jaxon, giggling, while the victim gasped for help, peering into the lens as if daring someone to stop him. When the judge read the sentence, 2 consecutive life terms plus 50 years, the laughter finally died. For the first time, Jaxon's smile vanished, replaced by terrified disbelief. He wanted to be remembered. He was. The morning of the arraignment, Jaxon Reed entered the Brookstone County Courthouse, wearing the standard orange jumpsuit issued to all pretrial detainees, a white undershirt visible at the collar. His walk was deliberate, almost theatrical. He moved with the loose swagger of someone convinced the world was watching and approving. Deputies flanked him, their expressions neutral and professional. But Jaxon seemed oblivious to the gravity of the situation. He smiled at the cameras lined along the corridor. Not the nervous smile of someone facing serious charges, but the confident grin of someone who believed this was all part of a larger performance. One photographer would later describe it as unsettling. Not because it showed remorse or fear, but because it showed neither. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with journalists, curious onlookers, members of the community who had followed the case since the night 3 months earlier when Marcus Webb, a 42-year-old convenience store clerk and father of 3, was shot and killed during what initially appeared to be a simple armed robbery. The case had drawn attention, not just because of the victim's death, but because of the defendant's age and his subsequent behavior. Jaxon had been arrested less than 2 hours after the shooting, found 3 blocks away from the crime scene, with the murder weapon still in his backpack. He had not tried to hide. He had not tried to run far. When officers approached him, he had laughed and said, "Took you long enough." Judge Ronan Price presided over the arraignment. He was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a face that had seen decades of human tragedy pass through his courtroom. He had a reputation for being fair but firm, unwilling to tolerate disruption or disrespect. As Jaxon was led to the defense table, Judge Price reviewed the file before him, his expression unreadable. Jackson's court-appointed attorney, a public defender named Thomas Caldwell, stood waiting. Caldwell was in his early 30s, competent but visibly uncomfortable with the media circus surrounding this case. He had met with Jaxon several times in the weeks leading up to this hearing, and each meeting had left him feeling more uncertain about his ability to mount an effective defense. His client seemed more interested in being quotable than in staying out of prison. Judge Price looked up from his papers and addressed the room. "This court is now in session. The matter before us is the state of Oregon versus Jaxon Reed. The defendant is charged with 1 count of murder in the 1st degree and 1 count of armed robbery. Mr. Reed, please stand." Jaxon rose slowly, his movements exaggerated, as though he was standing for applause. He turned slightly toward the gallery, and someone in the back row gasped when he flashed a peace sign with both hands. Judge Price's jaw tightened. "Mr. Reed, face forward." Jaxon turned back, the smile never leaving his face. The judge continued, "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" "I do, Your Majesty," Jaxon replied, his tone light, almost mocking. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Price's eyes narrowed. "It is Your Honor in this courtroom, Mr. Reed, not Your Majesty. Do you understand?" Jaxon shrugged. "Sure, Your Honor. My bad." "How do you plead to the charges of murder in the first degree and armed robbery?" "Not guilty," Jaxon said, still grinning. Then he turned to the gallery again and called out, "Your Majesty accepts donations for the defense fund." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled frantically. Spectators whispered. The victim's family, seated in the front row, looked on in horror. Judge Price slammed his gavel down hard. "Order! Mr. Reed, one more outburst like that and you will be removed from this courtroom. Do I make myself clear?" Jaxon turned back, his expression somewhere between amused and defiant. "Crystal, Your Honor." Judge Price turned his attention to the prosecution table, where Assistant District Attorney Maya West sat with her team. West was a seasoned prosecutor in her mid-40s, known for her meticulous case preparation and her ability to remain calm under pressure. She had prosecuted gang violence, domestic homicides, and cold cases that stretched back years. But this case felt different. The defendant was not trying to avoid conviction. He was trying to become famous for it. "Miss West, does the state wish to make a statement regarding bail?" West rose, smoothing the front of her blazer as she did. "Yes, Your Honor. The state requests that the defendant be held without bail. The charges are severe. Marcus Webb is dead, murdered in cold blood during a robbery. The defendant was apprehended with the murder weapon. He has shown no remorse and, in fact, has demonstrated a disturbing pattern of celebrating the crime. He presents a clear danger to the community and an obvious flight risk given the potential sentence he faces." Caldwell stood immediately. "Your Honor, Mr. Reed is 17 years old. He has no prior felony convictions. He has lived in Brookstone County his entire life. While the charges are serious, denying bail to a minor is extreme. We request reasonable bail so that he can assist in preparing his defense." Judge Price considered both arguments. He looked at Jaxon, who was now examining his fingernails as though the proceedings bored him. After a long pause, the judge spoke. "Given the severity of the charges, the defendant's behavior since his arrest, and the nature of the alleged crime, bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody pending trial. We will reconvene for a preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck. Jaxon turned to the gallery one last time and yelled, "Free J. Reed!" before the deputies pulled him toward the side exit. His voice echoed through the courtroom, even as the door closed behind him. West sat down heavily and exhaled. Her co-counsel, a younger man named Brian Torres, leaned over and whispered, "He is not scared. He is entertained." West nodded slowly. "That is exactly the problem, and we need to make sure the jury sees through the performance." The preliminary hearing, 3 weeks later, brought the first detailed look at the evidence the state had compiled. Detective Ronald Eves took the stand, a veteran investigator with the Brookstone County Sheriff's Office. He had 20 years of experience and a reputation for thoroughness. West led him through the basics of the investigation. Detective Eves, can you describe what you found when you responded to the scene on the night of July 14th? Eves adjusted the microphone and spoke in a measured tone. I arrived at Quick Stop Convenience on Baxter Avenue at approximately 9:30 in the evening. Patrol officers had already secured the perimeter. Inside, I observed the victim, Marcus Webb, lying behind the counter. He had sustained a single gunshot wound to the chest. Emergency medical services had attempted resuscitation, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. The cash register was open and empty. Surveillance cameras had been disabled, but we recovered footage from a neighboring business that showed a male matching the defendant's description entering the store at 9:07 and exiting at 9:11. What happened next in your investigation? We issued a description of the suspect based on the surveillance footage. At approximately 11:15 that same evening, patrol officers located the defendant 3 blocks from the crime scene. He was sitting on a bench eating fast food. When officers approached, he did not resist. He laughed and made a comment about them taking their time. Officers recovered a 9mm handgun from his backpack. Ballistics later confirmed it was the murder weapon. Did the defendant make any statements during his arrest? Yes. When officers informed him he was being arrested for the murder of Marcus Webb, he said, and he will quote, "Marcus who?" Then he laughed. When asked if he understood the charges, he said, "I understand I am about to be famous." West paused, letting that statement settle over the courtroom. Did you find any other evidence linking the defendant to the crime? Yes. We recovered DNA evidence from the scene. A partial fingerprint on the counter matched the defendant's prints. We also found gunshot residue on his hands and clothing. Additionally, we discovered text messages on his phone sent to multiple contacts in the hours before the robbery, stating he was about to pull off something legendary. Thank you, Detective. No further questions. Caldwell stood for cross-examination, but his questions were predictable, focused on establishing doubt about the DNA evidence, about whether the fingerprint could have been left at another time, about whether the text messages could have been bravado rather than intent. Eves answered each question calmly, methodically. By the end, it was clear the defense had little to work with. As the preliminary hearing continued, West called additional witnesses. The medical examiner testified about the cause of death, a single gunshot wound that had pierced Marcus Webb's heart, killing him within minutes. A forensic analyst testified about the gunshot residue found on Jaxon's hands and clothing, consistent with firing a weapon. A surveillance expert testified about the footage from the neighboring business, showing Jaxon entering and exiting the convenience store during the time frame of the murder. Throughout all of this, Jaxon sat at the defense table with an expression of bored amusement. At one point, during the medical examiner's testimony about the fatal wound, he yawned exaggeratedly. The bailiff leaned over and whispered a warning. Jaxon smirked and nodded. But minutes later, when a witness described finding Marcus Webb's body, Jaxon began humming softly. The judge stopped the proceedings immediately. "Mr. Reed, you will remain silent or you will be removed from this courtroom. This is your final warning." Jaxon held up his hands in mock surrender. "Sorry, Your Honor, I will be good." Judge Price did not look convinced, but he allowed the hearing to continue. By the end of the day, it was clear there was more than enough evidence to proceed to trial. The judge ruled accordingly, scheduling the trial to begin in 4 months. As Jackson was led out of the courtroom, he turned to the reporters and photographers lining the hallway and shouted, "Do not forget to tag me!" The cameras flashed. His image would appear on news websites within the hour, and by evening, memes featuring his smirking face and raised peace signs would circulate on social media. He had achieved exactly what he wanted. He was trending. But back in the prosecutor's office, Detective Eves was reviewing evidence that had not yet been presented in court. During the search of Jackson's belongings, investigators had recovered his cell phone. The phone had been heavily damaged, the screen cracked, the internal memory corrupted. But the digital forensics team had been working to recover deleted files, and they had found something. Fragments of a video file, uploaded to a cloud backup server during the time of the murder. The file had been deleted from the phone, but the server had retained a copy. Eves called West immediately. "Maya, you need to see this," he said, his voice tight. "We found a live stream backup. He filmed the whole thing." The trial began 4 months later. By then, the case had attracted national media attention. Jaxon Reed had become a symbol, though what he symbolized depended on who was speaking. Some saw him as a product of a broken system, a homeless teenager failed by society. Others saw him as a remorseless killer who viewed violence as entertainment. The courtroom was packed every day, with additional overflow seating set up in an adjacent room where people could watch via closed-circuit feed. Security had been increased. The jury selection process had been exhaustive, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for bias and preconceptions. 12 jurors and 4 alternates were eventually seated, a diverse group ranging in age from 23 to 67. West's opening statement was direct and unflinching. She stood before the jury, her hands clasped in front of her, her tone calm but firm. "This case is about a young man who believed that violence could make him famous. Jaxon Reed did not rob Marcus Webb because he was desperate. He did not kill Marcus Webb because he was afraid. He robbed and killed Marcus Webb because he wanted attention. He wanted followers. He wanted to be known. And he got what he wanted, but not in the way he imagined. Over the course of this trial, you will see evidence that leaves no doubt. You will hear testimony from investigators, forensic experts, and people who knew the defendant. And you will see something truly shocking. A video, a live stream that the defendant recorded during the commission of this crime. A video in which he brags, taunts, and ultimately kills an innocent man while smiling into a camera. This is not a tragedy. This is a choice. And Jaxon Reed must face the consequences of that choice. Caldwell's opening statement took a different approach. He stood before the jury, his expression somber. Jaxon Reed is 17 years old. He has lived on the streets for most of his teenage years. He has experienced poverty, neglect, and trauma that most of us cannot imagine. Does that excuse what happened? No, but it provides context. The prosecution wants you to believe that Jaxon is a calculating killer who planned this crime for fame. But the truth is more complicated. Jaxon is a scared kid who made a terrible mistake. The gun went off. Marcus Webb died. And now Jaxon is facing life in prison. The evidence will show that this was not premeditated murder. This was a robbery gone wrong, committed by a frightened teenager who panicked. We ask you to consider all the facts, all the context, before you make a decision that will affect the rest of his life. The first week of trial established the facts of the case. West called witnesses who described the crime scene, the investigation, the forensic analysis. The medical examiner testified again about the cause of death. The ballistics expert confirmed that the gun recovered from Jackson's backpack was the murder weapon. A fingerprint analyst testified about the prints found at the scene. A DNA expert explained the evidence linking Jaxon to the crime. Throughout all of this, Jaxon maintained his demeanor of amused detachment. He took notes on a legal pad, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to Caldwell. He never looked distressed. He never looked worried. When particularly damaging testimony was presented, he would shrug or smirk, as though the entire proceeding were beneath him. One of the most damaging witnesses during the first week was a former acquaintance of Jackson's, a young man named Travis Munoz, who had known him from the streets. West called Travis to the stand on the fourth day of trial. "Mr. Munoz, how do you know the defendant?" Travis shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact with Jaxon. "We hung out sometimes, on the streets, shared food, looked out for each other." "Did the defendant ever talk to you about committing crimes?" Travis nodded. "Yeah, he talked about it all the time. He said he was going to do something big, something that would get him noticed. He said he was tired of being invisible." "Did he ever mention live streaming or recording his crimes?" "Yeah, he said he wanted to go viral. He said people only care about you if you give them something to watch. He talked about other people who got famous for doing crazy stuff, and he said he could do better." "Did he ever mention Marcus Webb or the Quick Stop convenience store?" Travis hesitated, then nodded. "A few days before it happened, he told me he had picked a target. He said it was a small store, easy hit, and he was going to record it. I told him that was stupid. I told him he would get caught. He just laughed and said, 'That is the point.' He said getting caught was part of the plan, because then everyone would talk about him." "Thank you, Mr. Munoz. No further questions." Caldwell's cross-examination attempted to undermine Travis's credibility, suggesting he might be testifying in exchange for leniency on his own pending charges, suggesting his memory might be faulty. But Travis held firm. The damage was done. The jury had heard testimony that Jaxon had planned not just the robbery, but the recording of it, and that he viewed arrest as a feature rather than a bug. The second week of trial brought the digital evidence. West called to the stand a digital forensics expert named Dr. Caroline Fisher, who had examined Jackson's phone and recovered the deleted files. Dr. Fisher explained the process methodically. When someone live streams video on certain social media platforms, the video is temporarily saved to a backup server in case the stream is interrupted. Even if the user deletes the video afterward, the backup file often remains on the server for a period of time. In this case, the defendant used a live streaming application that automatically backed up his stream to a cloud server. He deleted the video from his phone after the crime, but the backup file remained on the server. We were able to obtain a warrant and recover it. West moved closer to the witness stand. "Dr. Fisher, can you describe what this video contains?" Dr. Fisher glanced at her notes. "The video is approximately 4 minutes and 30 seconds long. It begins with the defendant entering the Quick Stop convenience store. He is holding his phone, filming himself. He approaches the counter where Marcus Webb is standing. The audio is clear. The defendant says, 'This is it, people. Watch history.' He then pulls out a gun and points it at Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb raises his hands and says, 'Please, just take the money.' The defendant opens the cash register and begins removing bills. But then he turns the camera back to Mr. Webb and says, 'Say you have been robbed by J. Reed, king of the streets.' Mr. Webb looks terrified. He says, 'Please, I have kids.' The defendant laughs. Then there is a gunshot. The camera shakes. Mr. Webb falls out of frame. The defendant turns the camera back to himself, and he is smiling. He says, "Did you see that?" before the video cuts off. The courtroom was silent. Several jurors looked visibly shaken. One woman covered her mouth. West let the moment sit before continuing. "Dr. Fisher, have you verified the authenticity of this video?" "Yes, we examined the metadata. The timestamp corresponds to the night of the murder, the exact time frame established by other evidence. The location data embedded in the file confirms it was recorded at the Quick Stop convenience store. We also analyzed the video for signs of editing or manipulation. There are none. This is an unaltered recording of the crime as it happened." West turned to face the jury. "This video is the single most important piece of evidence in this case. It shows, in the defendant's own words and actions, exactly what happened that night. It shows that this was not a panicked mistake. It was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a planned, deliberate act of violence, carried out for the purpose of gaining attention. The defendant filmed himself committing murder because he believed it would make him famous. And now that video will be used to hold him accountable." She returned to her seat. Caldwell stood for cross-examination, but he looked pale. He asked a few questions about the chain of custody, about whether the video could have been manipulated before being uploaded to the server. Dr. Fisher calmly explained that the video had been analyzed by multiple independent experts, all of whom confirmed its authenticity. Caldwell sat down, defeated. The next witness was Marcus Webb's daughter, a woman in her early 20s named Elena Webb. She testified about her father, about his kindness, his dedication to his family, his long hours working at the convenience store to support his children. She spoke through tears, describing how her father's death had shattered their family. She looked directly at Jaxon as she spoke. "He killed my father for a video. He killed him for views. My father begged for his life, and he laughed. How do you live with that?" Jaxon looked away, his expression unreadable. For the first time since the trial began, his smirk faltered. But it returned moments later, as though he had remembered he was supposed to be performing. As the third week of trial began, the prosecution was nearing the end of its case. West had established motive, means, and opportunity. She had presented overwhelming forensic evidence. She had shown that Jaxon had planned the crime, carried it out, and celebrated it afterward. But she had not yet shown the jury the video itself. She had described it, had experts testify about it, but she had not played it. That moment was reserved for maximum impact. On the 15th day of trial, West stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the state requests permission to present video evidence to the jury. This is the live stream backup file recovered from the defendant's cloud server, authenticated by Dr. Caroline Fisher and multiple independent experts. We believe it is essential for the jury to see this evidence in order to understand the full scope of the defendant's actions and intent." Judge Price looked at Caldwell. "Does the defense have any objection?" Caldwell rose slowly. "Your Honor, we object on the grounds that the video is highly prejudicial. Its inflammatory nature could unduly influence the jury." Judge Price considered this. "The video is relevant to the charges. It directly depicts the crime. The probative value outweighs any prejudicial effect. Objection overruled. The video may be shown." West nodded. She turned to the bailiff, who dimmed the courtroom lights and activated the projection screen at the front of the room. The jury sat forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the screen. Jaxon, for the first time, looked uncertain. His smile had faded. His hands, resting on the table, clenched into fists. West pressed play. The video filled the screen. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as Jackson's face appeared, grinning into the camera. They heard his voice, excited and confident. "This is it, people. Watch history." The video shook as he moved through the store. Then the camera shifted, showing Marcus Webb behind the counter, looking up in confusion. The gun appeared in frame, pointed directly at Marcus. "Please, just take the money," Marcus said, his voice shaking. Jaxon laughed, a high, manic sound. The camera focused on Marcus's terrified face. "Say you have been robbed by J. Reed, king of the streets." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "Please, I have kids." Another laugh from Jaxon. Then the gunshot, deafening even through the courtroom speakers. The camera jerked. Marcus disappeared from view. The camera swung back to Jackson's face, still grinning. "Did you see that?" And then the screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Several jurors were crying. Elena Webb, sitting in the front row, sobbed openly. Jaxon sat frozen at the defense table, his eyes wide, his face pale. His mother, seated in the gallery, wept into her hands. West stood and addressed the jury, her voice steady but filled with controlled anger. "That is who Jaxon Reed is. Not a scared kid who made a mistake, not a victim of circumstance. A young man who murdered someone for entertainment, who filmed himself committing murder because he thought it would make him a star, who laughed as a father of 3 begged for his life. That video is the truth. Everything else is an excuse." She sat down. Caldwell did not cross-examine. There was nothing he could say. The video had done all the talking. The prosecution rested its case the following day. Caldwell called a few witnesses in the defense's case: a social worker who testified about Jackson's difficult childhood, a psychologist who discussed the effects of trauma and homelessness on adolescent brain development, a former teacher who said Jaxon had shown potential before dropping out of school. But none of it mattered. The video had obliterated any sympathy the jury might have felt. Closing arguments took place on the 18th day of trial. West spoke first, summarizing the evidence. She reminded the jury of the forensic evidence, the testimony of witnesses, the video. She reminded them that Jaxon had not just committed murder, he had celebrated it, he had recorded it, he had bragged about it. She ended by saying, "Jaxon Reed wanted to be famous. He wanted to be remembered. Now he will be, but not as a king, as a murderer. And the sentence for that is not fame, it is justice." Caldwell's closing argument was brief. He acknowledged the tragedy, the horror of what had happened. He asked the jury to consider Jackson's age, his background, his lack of guidance. He asked for mercy. But his words felt hollow after what the jury had seen. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty of murder in the 1st degree. Guilty of armed robbery. Jaxon sat motionless as the verdict was read. For the first time, the smile was gone completely. He looked at his mother in the gallery. She was crying, her face buried in her hands. He looked at the jury, then at the judge, then down at his hands. Reality, it seemed, was finally setting in. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that time, victim impact statements were prepared. Marcus Webb's family wrote about the hole left in their lives, the father and grandfather who would never see another birthday, another holiday, another family gathering. Eleanor Webb wrote about her father's dreams for his children, dreams that had been stolen by someone who valued fame more than life. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was filled once again. Jaxon was led in wearing his orange jumpsuit and white undershirt. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. The swagger was gone. He sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, his eyes on the floor. West and her team sat across from him, calm and prepared. The victim's family filled the front rows, their faces etched with grief and anger. Judge Price entered and took his seat. He reviewed the file before him, then looked up at the courtroom. This is a sentencing hearing for Jaxon Reed, convicted of murder in the first degree and armed robbery. Before I impose sentence, I will hear from the victim's family. Elena Webb stood first. Her voice was strong, despite the tears streaming down her face. My father was a good man. He worked hard. He loved his family. He never hurt anyone. And he was murdered by someone who thought killing him would be entertaining. Jaxon Reed filmed my father's death. He laughed while my father begged for his life. He showed no mercy, and he deserves none. I hope he spends the rest of his life remembering what he did. I hope he hears my father's voice every night. I hope he never knows peace. She sat down, and her brothers stood next, each speaking about their father, about the pain of losing him, about the cruelty of his death. When they finished, Judge Price turned his attention to Jaxon. Mr. Reed, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of murder in the first degree and armed robbery. Before I impose sentence, I want to say something to you directly. Jaxon looked up, his eyes red, his face streaked with tears. Judge Price's expression was cold, his voice measured, but filled with contempt. I have presided over this court for 22 years. I have seen many defendants stand where you stand now. I have seen people who committed crimes out of desperation, out of rage, out of circumstances they could not control. I have seen people who deserved a second chance, who showed remorse, who took responsibility for their actions. You are not one of those people. He paused, letting the words sink in. You murdered Marcus Webb, not because you were desperate, not because you were afraid. You murdered him because you wanted attention. You wanted fame. You wanted people to talk about you, to remember you. You filmed his death because you thought it would make you a star. You laughed while he begged for his life. You smiled into a camera seconds after pulling the trigger. You treated a human being's death as entertainment. Jaxon's hands trembled. A sob escaped his throat, but Judge Price continued, his voice rising. You sat in this courtroom day after day, mocking the process, disrespecting the victims, performing for cameras. You called me Your Majesty. You yelled slogans to reporters. You acted as though this trial were a joke, as though consequence was something that happened to other people. You believed your youth would protect you. You believed your circumstances would excuse you. You were wrong. He leaned forward, his gaze locked on Jaxon. You wanted to be remembered, Mr. Reed. You wanted to be the king of the streets. Well, I'm about to grant your wish, but not in the way you imagined. You will be remembered, not as a king, not as someone bold or fearless. You will be remembered as a coward who killed an innocent man for a video. You will be remembered as someone who valued clicks more than a human life. And you will spend the rest of your existence in a cell, forgotten by everyone except the family whose lives you destroyed. Judge Price picked up the sentencing document and read aloud. For the murder of Marcus Webb, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the armed robbery, I sentence you to an additional 50 years to be served consecutively. You will never leave prison. You will never experience freedom again. You made entertainment of agony. You wanted fame. You have earned infamy. The walls of your cell will be the only audience you will ever have again. Jaxon broke completely. The tears that had been building spilled over, and he sobbed openly, his body shaking. He tried to speak, tried to say something, but the words would not come. He looked at his mother in the gallery, who was weeping uncontrollably. He looked at the judge, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. The performance was over. The mask had shattered. He was just a 17-year-old boy who had made an irreversible mistake, and the full weight of it had finally crushed him. Judge Price set down the document. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck. Jaxon was led away, his legs unsteady, his face buried in his hands. He did not look at the cameras this time. He did not shout slogans or flash peace signs. He was led through the side door, and the sound of his sobbing echoed through the courtroom long after he disappeared. In the weeks following the sentencing, Jaxon Reed's name did trend on social media, but not in the way he had imagined. People shared the video of his sentencing, his collapse, his tears. They shared articles about Marcus Webb, about his family, about the hole left in their lives. Jaxon became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when the pursuit of fame eclipses basic humanity. Legislators in Oregon introduced a bill to increase penalties for crimes committed and filmed for the purpose of gaining publicity or notoriety. The bill was called Marcus's Law. Marcus Webb's family established a scholarship fund in his name, providing financial assistance to children of single parents pursuing higher education. Elena Webb spoke at schools about the dangers of glorifying violence, about the real human cost behind viral videos. She never mentioned Jaxon by name. She did not need to. Everyone knew who she was talking about. Jaxon Reed was sent to a maximum security facility in eastern Oregon, where he would spend the rest of his life. The boy who had wanted to be king of the streets became inmate number 743921. The boy who had wanted millions of followers had none. The boy who had wanted to be remembered became a footnote, a warning, a name people invoked when discussing the toxic intersection of social media and violence. But for those who had been in the courtroom that day, the image of Jaxon's final moments remained. The way his smile had finally, irrevocably died. The way his hands had shaken as the judge spoke. The way his voice had broken when he realized that fame was not freedom, that notoriety was not power, that trending was not the same as mattering. He had wanted to live forever in the public consciousness. Instead, he would live forever behind bars. His only audience, the walls of his cell, and the memory of a good man he had killed for a video that no one wanted to watch. The courtroom was cleaned. The files were archived. The cameras moved on to new stories. But in the prosecutor's office, Maya West kept a photograph on her desk. It was a picture of Marcus Webb with his family, all of them smiling, taken a week before his death. She looked at it every morning before court, a reminder of why she did this work, of who she was fighting for. Not for headlines, or convictions, or career advancement, for the people who could not speak for themselves anymore, for the families left behind, for justice. And in a cell in eastern Oregon, Jaxon Reed sat on a narrow bunk, staring at a wall. The silence was complete. No followers, no views, no fame, only walls, only time. Only the knowledge that he had traded a man's life for a few minutes of attention, and those few minutes had cost him everything. He whispered to himself sometimes, late at night when the facility was quiet, "But I am still trending." But the words sounded hollow even to him, because he knew the truth. He was not trending. He was forgotten, and he would remain forgotten for the rest of his life. A cautionary tale told to children about the dangers of confusing notoriety with importance, violence with courage, attention with love. The boy who wanted to be king had become nothing. And in the end, that was the only justice that mattered.